A 14-year-old is behind bars in Florida accused of beating her grandmother to death. Now prosecutors are making a stunning announcement. They're charging the teen as an adult. The horrific beating happened in late May of this year. According to authorities, they responded to an apartment complex in Lauderdale Lakes, Florida, after receiving a call about an unresponsive woman. It was there they met the son of 79-year-old Yevheniia Koval, who said he went to visit a friend that evening and left his daughter with his mother. His daughter was 14-year-old Sofia Koval. According to Sofia's father, when he returned home, he found his mother unresponsive on the floor with abrasions on her neck and bruising on her arms, legs, and face. Police say Sofia told her dad that her grandmother had scratched her, so she hit her grandmother several times with a belt to defend herself. According to the arrest report, the teen then began crying and said she was sorry for what she had done. Yevheniia Koval was rushed to a local hospital, however, she was pronounced dead. The Broward County Medical Examiner's Office ruled Yevhenia's death as a homicide, and her teenage granddaughter was arrested for the fatal beating. But authorities would unveil more during their investigation. The teen allegedly told someone in the Ukraine that her grandmother was already dying and that she had helped her die. According to Sofia's father, Sofia had recently moved from Ukraine and was displaying behavioral issues, which he believed are from the war she witnessed in Ukraine and being separated from her mother. On the day of the killing, Sofia's father took her phone away to discipline her. And after the killing, the arrest report notes the teen was very agitated and appeared aggressive at times. She was also constantly moving around, and it appeared she was suffering from a possible psychotic episode. So she was Baker acted or involuntarily confined for a mental health exam. But on the way to Fort Lauderdale Behavioral Health Center, Koval allegedly made spontaneous utterances that she killed her grandmother. According to NBC6 in South Florida, a redacted source in the arrest report said Sofia had never been diagnosed with a mental illness, but was showing signs of aggression and being agitated. The 14-year-old was also not eating or sleeping. That source also reportedly believed the teen may have used her grandmother's walker to hit her because they noticed a piece of the walker was broken. Then this Tuesday, another twist. Prosecutors formally filed the manslaughter charge against Sofia and moved her from juvenile detention to the Broward County Jail, where she'll be held in protective custody. A judge ordered she be held without bond. In Florida, the maximum sentence for manslaughter is 15 years in prison if she's convicted, but the 14-year-old could be sentenced to juvenile sanctions. The state attorney's office released a statement saying, quote, "In the juvenile system, anyone found guilty and sentenced would have to be released after a maximum of 3 years and could only be kept under supervision in the community until age 21. Because she is not a U.S. citizen, she could be subject to deportation." We have a lot to break down in this case, so here joining me to discuss it further is attorney Melba Pearson. Melba, always great to have you on. This story, like so many others that we cover here, is very horrific and shocking. A teenager accused of killing her grandmother, but she's no longer facing second-degree murder. Instead, it's manslaughter, but she's being charged as an adult. What's your reaction to this case and your thoughts on her being tried as an adult?
Yeah, so thank you again for having me on. And this is actually another one of those cases that's literally in my backyard. I live in Miami and this occurred in Broward County. But I just, the first reaction to me is what went wrong? Because from all reports, it seems that this is very out of character for the young lady. That she really didn't have any signs of violence before, any real anger problems. Again, based on what's being reported, obviously more will be revealed as I'm sure she'll be evaluated for competency and or if maybe there's a mental illness she may be struggling with. Additionally, there seems to be some concerns around her being separated from her mother. That's not saying that it excuses what she did, but when you see a child committing a crime of that magnitude, and for it to be so personal. So this wasn't the fantasizing, I'm going to be a school shooter or something along those lines. This is something very personal and very violent and very intimate. So to me, that screams of a child that's lashing out. And, this is, of course, incredibly tragic for this family because now not only have they lost, a matriarch, they're also basically going to lose their child in some way, shape, or form. So, but the other thing that, of course, strikes me is the fact that she is being tried as an adult and that apparently it's, viewed that the juvenile system cannot work with and assist children that are charged with murder. And studies have very clearly shown that the human brain does not fully develop until the age of 26. So to hold a child accountable the same way you would an adult is very problematic from a scientific as well as a legal perspective. So I think there's a lot more that we need to dig in here to understand why this happened. And then once we understand what happened, what the appropriate punishment should be.
And besides age, what's the biggest difference of trying a case when the defendant is a teenager as opposed to trying an adult?
So, a couple of different things. Number one, the child being tried in the adult system does not mean they automatically are going to face adult sanctions. Depending on the situation, there is the opportunity for the child to receive juvenile sanctions, which could include some sort of detention within a juvenile facility. It could include going to a particular facility, almost like a, for lack of a better word, almost like a boarding school, right? But that is particularly designed for children that are struggling with various issues that resulted in them being in the criminal justice system. And there's other types of interventions that could be used from the juvenile system while the child will still have basically an adult conviction. So it's a weird hybrid. But again, the reality is, if she goes to trial, she is facing 15 years in prison as an adult. So it all depends on either the prosecutor coming up with a plea agreement that's acceptable to all parties, which in my gut, I think that's where this is going to go. I highly doubt this is going to go to trial. But if it does go to trial, then it would be up to the judge to decide whether or not to sentence her as a juvenile or sentence her as an adult.
And I was reading a max sentence on manslaughter is 15 years. So if convicted and she gets the max sentence, she could be out by her early 30s. What are your thoughts on that? And in your opinion, do you agree with her only being charged with manslaughter as opposed to her original charge of second degree murder?
I agree with the charge of manslaughter because, again, this seemed just from the little that we know about this, there doesn't seem to have been any premeditation. So, that, of course, would discount first degree murder. Reckless and wanton disregard for human life or heat of passion is usually what second degree murder is used for. But again, I don't know that that necessarily fits. Because again, we just don't know enough about the facts to know if she had been fighting with her grandmother and then this was a result of that, or what exactly happened here. I think manslaughter is probably the most appropriate charge because it still speaks to the fact that she did kill someone. um, and it also has that lower maximum sentence, which again, when you're looking at this as a young person being the perpetrator, it may fit better, especially in the light that this was a domestic violence, for lack of a better word, because it is, family on family. This was a domestic violence situation. You have a young child who may not have necessarily understood the gravity of their actions. So I think the charge is appropriate. Now, if she does get convicted as an adult and ends up doing the maximum, which again, I doubt that would happen, but let's say hypothetically she does get the 15 years in prison, I have a lot of concerns about that because unfortunately, as a general premise, our system is not really set up for rehabilitation. So if the issues that got her to this place where she reacted so violently are not addressed, she's going to reoffend. And it's going to be even more severe because when you think about the fact that 15 years in prison, granted, she'll probably do about 85% of that because of our game time laws here in the state of Florida. But still, in the 10, 12 years she may be in custody, is she really going to be getting anger management treatment? Is she going to be getting some of the other coping mechanisms that she's going to need to be able to function in day to day life once she's released? Is she going to have a support system once she's released? Is her family even going to be there for her? So I think that if we don't structure something properly to be able to ensure that she gets the coping skills she needs to move forward, she's going to end up reoffending once she's released. And that is sad because of the fact that it is avoidable.
And what do you make of the behavioral issues Koval was experiencing prior to the murder? The arrest report said it appeared that Sophia was suffering from a psychotic episode.
Yeah, I could see that as a reasonable explanation for what happened because, again, if there had been no prior interactions between the two that were of a violent nature, the police hadn't responded to the house previously, no one had to, separate them, or did the grandmother ever express that she was in fear of her granddaughter? All of these things, if it's completely out of the blue, to me, that does speak to a mental illness, and potentially whether it be a temporary psychotic break or something much deeper like a bipolar manic depression or schizophrenia or something along those lines, which can be managed with medication. And of course, to be clear, just because someone has mental illness does not mean that they're going to react violently and harm people or harm themselves. There are many people with mental illness that take their medicine every day and go about their daily lives without a problem. But again, if there is a mental health component to this, it needs to be addressed because if left untreated, it's only going to get worse. And again, that could lead to violent reoffending.
And Sophia told her father that her grandmother scratched her and she struck her grandmother several times with the belt to defend herself. Do you think that may have played a part into the charge being lowered from second degree murder to manslaughter? That whole little aspect of potential self defense?
Her response was not proportionate to what her grandmother may have done. So a scratch does not warrant beating someone to death. So I don't think it was a matter of self defense that was the driver in reducing the charges. I think it's more along the lines of whether mental illness played a role, her age, and also the fact that there may have been a lack of a violent history or lack of any criminal history.
And we recently covered another case kind of similar, that being Carly Gregg, a 15-year-old in Mississippi who was convicted in the shooting death of her mom and shooting her stepfather. With that being said, her attorney recently filed an appeal in part citing that a 14, 15-year-old didn't have the understanding of participating in her own defense, and the jurors of her peers were much older. So, with all that being said, if she's not offered a plea deal and the case goes to trial, this I'm talking about Sofia Koval, what are your thoughts on any type of appeal process in this case, especially given, that a jury of her peers would be much older, given they might be 18 years old and up, as opposed to in Mississippi, 21 years older and up. But what are your thoughts on just the whole appeal process and how that can kind of play out in the court system if she is convicted?
I think that is very interesting grounds for appeal because, again, we're looking at competency. And so, does a 14, 15-year old understand, in making that decision of whether or not to testify? Do they understand what that means? They may choose not to testify just out of fear because they're nervous or whatever the case may be, but they also may not realize the implications that come with that. Can they really make that knowing waiver of their rights? That's really tough. Obviously, there are 15-year-olds that are highly intelligent and gifted, even that can easily grasp these concepts, but not every child is the same in the way that they process information, especially if it's done through the lens of trauma or potentially mental illness. So the competency aspect, excuse me, is going to be very critical here, and what steps the court takes to ensure that she's understanding everything every step of the way, whether that's appointing a guardian ad litem to make sure that they're there to support them, and taking that extra time to explain each and every aspect of the trial as you move forward. I think all of that would play into whether or not an appeal could be successful, because you have to be able to establish that the child understood what was going on. And again, that's why it's often better to keep the child in the juvenile system, or the flip side of that would be to have a bench trial, because again, now you're in a situation where there's no jury and it's just the judge who is going to make a decision on both the facts and the law, and can maybe put aside some of the emotion that may be running through the intense facts that may come out during the trial.
And I can't even imagine what it's like to come from the Ukraine to the United States and then you end up in a Broward County jail. You're not in a youth detention center anymore. Now you're in a Broward County jail awaiting trial. What do you think it's like for her to kind of go through? And again, I'm not excusing anything that she's been accused of, but what are your thoughts on just kind of that whole process of going through that, where you thought you were going to be safe in a new place, kind of gonna go about things like normal teenagers do, and then you end up again in jail behind bars.
I would think that that'd be incredibly traumatizing for her. I think it's going to be traumatizing for the entire family because, again, they're dealing with so many layers of grief. And again, depending on where she is in her competency and in her mental state, she may be grieving as well because it may now have clicked that she killed her grandmother, who is someone that she purportedly, again, based on what's been reported at this point in time, had a good relationship with. So once that episode sort of subsides and she has that moment of clarity, it's going to be incredibly, incredibly painful for her. So I think there's that aspect. And then of course, being incarcerated is just a traumatic experience in and of itself. I mean, people don't really think that deeply into it, but it's incredibly loud, it's noisy, it's violent, there's fights, there's, people screaming at you, whether it be guards or other incarcerated people alongside of you. It's not necessarily clean. So there's so many layers to this that are incredibly traumatizing, especially for a child who, number one, doesn't even may not even necessarily understand the US criminal justice system. And then secondly, may even have not only just the trauma of what she's dealing with, her mental health status, but if she was exposed to war in the Ukraine. And that is, again, that trauma of being at war and watching people die, watching buildings get bombed, all of that could be contributing to any mental health break she is having now. So again, this is in no way to justify what she did, but once we understand what happened or what may be the drivers, then you can figure out what the most just outcome should be based on the situation.
All right, Melba, I appreciate your insight into this case. Before I sign you off, anything else you'd like to add?
It's just that, again, my heart goes out to the family because they are definitely suffering on so many levels. And of course, I have to always highlight that domestic violence takes a lot of different forms. It's not necessarily partner on partner. It can be child on parent. It could be, and this could be an adult child on parent, etc. So if you find yourself in that situation, definitely reach out and get the resources you need to be able to assist you before it gets out of hand and unfortunately sometimes fatal.
Thank you so much, Melba, again for your time today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you, Elizabeth.
A judge ordered Sofia Koval be held in jail without bond. Online court records don't reveal her next court date, but according to recent court documents, Sofia's attorneys are demanding a jury trial. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Elizabeth Millner.